All I can remember is being exhausted. Peter and I had stayed up the night before discussing who among us was really the greatest. Tonight was different. He was troubled. Took us to the garden and asked a few of us to come a little closer. The only thing he really asked of us was to keep watch. I was so tired. I remember thinking if I could just close my eyes for a couple of minutes, that'd help me in the long run. And then I woke up to his tender voice asking us why we couldn't even watch and stay up with him for an hour. He told us that our flesh was weak, but our spirits were willing. And he was right. I was weak, but I was willing. And then he left again to be alone. The next few minutes were so hard, still fighting this exhaustion. My eyes were so incredibly heavy. But once again, I slipped off to sleep. You know, they killed him. He died, and I couldn't even sacrifice some sleep. It's crazy. He gave everything for me. I wasn't even willing to sacrifice the smallest thing. The day had come. I finally turned 5 years old. I was excited until I found out what that really meant. And that I was going to school this year. Then things kind of took a turn for the worst. I'd have to go somewhere and sit and learn. No more of all this playing all day and things going well. Enjoying myself and enjoying life. Well, a couple weeks into this, my mom came to me with a proposition. She decided that it was time to give my vroom vroom away. There's a little need for some interpretation here, I realize. It's important to note that my vroom vroom was a plastic, three-wheeled hot rod that I rode every day until I had to go off to school. The vroom vroom had sat in the backyard for quite a while now, and grass was beginning to grow around it. My mom proposed that we give my vroom vroom to the family daycare down the street. She had no idea what she was asking me. Give away my prized possession? My vroom vroom? But for some reason, I agreed. The next day, the vroom vroom was gone. It wasn't until a couple days later my father was bringing me home from school. I looked over and saw the family daycare and some kids gathered around, seemingly enjoying themselves. Upon closer investigation, I realized that these children were taking turn after turn, riding my vroom vroom down the hill. At first, I was angry, but then something happened. I realized something about sacrifice that day that changed my world. It didn't feel good to give away my prized possession. Actually, it hurt. But the moment I saw the joy that it carried to those children, I realized that this was not about me at all. Sacrifice was about giving something that was made of plastic, was not about giving something that was made of plastic and had three wheels. It was about giving the gift of joy and love. Sacrifice literally means an act of giving something up that is valued for the sake of something else regarded as more important or worthy. In the book of 1 John chapter 3, we're reminded of a story we find in Genesis of two brothers. Both are asked to sacrifice something before the Lord. Abel makes the sacrifice and the Lord is pleased. And Cain makes a sacrifice and Yahweh is not pleased. Yet, how these two brothers react to the sacrifice and what was done shapes the roads they took. You know the story. Cain rises up against Abel and kills him. Our relationship with God and our brothers and sisters are interlocked to why and what we sacrifice. In many ways, we have thrown the baby out with the bathwater, however. We understand the sacrificial system. We understand that on the cross it went away. No longer do we find ourselves going to the church doors and sacrificing pigeons and perfect unspotted lambs. The sacrificial system went away. But yet we then have in turn taken it upon ourselves to no longer think about sacrifice at all. We put all the pressure on Christ. Christ has taken care of all of it. No longer do we need or have a responsibility to sacrifice to God or to each other. No longer must we give away portions of our 401k or bank accounts. Yet the need of sacrifice is ever more present in the world we live in today. We like to think of sacrifice as an outward sign of submission to God and people, yet we are reminded of Christ in the Sermon on the Mount, telling us that sanctification is also an internal process. God wants to see us sacrifice the sins of our hearts. I sacrifice my wants and desires until my wants and desires become sacrificial. Walter Brueggemann states that compassion constitutes a radical form of criticism, for it announces that the hurt is to be taken seriously, that the hurt is not to be accepted as normal or natural, but as abnormal and unacceptable condition for humanness. When we take the hurt of this world serious as not a part of God's plan, we too have to take serious our role in redemption. Redemption, friends, takes sacrifice. You know, growing up, I used to think the only way to really sacrifice the way Christ called me to was to live as a martyr. I read books about Lottie Moon and Jim Elliot, who had given their lives for the extension of the gospel of Christ. Yet when I look around this room, I see that that is not the path for everyone. I see preachers and teachers. I see prophets. I see administrators in this room. We are not all called to one place or to another. But the gospel, the book of 1 John reminds us that this is for all people, of all callings, of all places, going to all things. That we are all called to a life of sacrifice. In chapter 3, we're reminded of Cain's response to God saying he was not his brother's keeper. But what we learn in this text that you and I are our brother and our sister's keepers every day. We have a responsibility in this world today. In a conversation with a 9-year-old just this week, I asked him about his own interpretation of sin. He told me that sin to him was when he decided not to love God or not to love someone else. Sin is refusing to do what love requires. Love requires sacrifice. The fact is that we are created for relationships. God saw Adam alone and said that this is not good. God saw Adam alone and said, this is not good, for I have created the creation to have relationship with me and to have relationship with one another. Relationships are part of our lives every day. We must be willing to give up our agendas, our plans, our preconceived notions, our racism, our classism, our sexism, and our American dreams, our comfortable pews, and even maybe our institutions. Relationships will leave us hurting, bleeding, and crying. Yet relationships will leave us more full of joy than we ever thought possible. A greater purpose than we could ever live for. Healed by the love of a neighbor and redeemed by the grace of God. As the writer says in the beginning of these verses, you have heard this from the beginning. Class, we have heard this from the beginning. That we are to love God and love one another. How many times just this year will you and I hear sermon or conversation about what love means in the world? What the love of God means to us as individuals and us as the community. We've heard it from the beginning. But I think it's high time that we start looking at it and what does this form take in the world? What does this mean for my life personally? How do I come into this world and still love, knowing that I have all the baggage and sinful nature that I have? I start with realizing sacrifice has to happen on an internal level, and then I must sacrifice when I come out into this world to what I give to others, not just of possessions, but of also the love and the care, the grace and the mercy that I hand out each and every day. We like to discuss what absolute truth is and is not. These scriptures, however, remind us where the fruit of truth lies. We want to talk about truth, then it's time we start talking about fruit. We can say we believe in the truth of the cross, yet are we willing to respond, even follow Christ to Golgotha? Can we stop talking about the Roman road and simply start walking down the road of life with people? We have baptized our heads and our bodies, but we must have left our calendars, our pocketbooks, and our purses on dry land. We say we believe that Christ was a man, but do we serve him as if he had facial expressions? Do we think upon the holes that the crowns left in his head? Think about the blood that trickled down and mingled with his tears, dripped off the bottom of his beard. Think on the contours of his face as his lips begin to quiver. Could we be numb then? Could we still be numb, not willing to sacrifice a thing for God or for people, if we served a God with facial expressions? We say we believe the truth of resurrection, but do we work for redemption in the world that is living in death? Do we seek to roll the stones away and see resurrection in the world today? Then go and sacrifice. Give away your rooms. Do what it takes to reach your brothers and your sisters, no matter where they come from and no matter who they are. Because I couldn't sacrifice sleep that night. But he sacrificed everything. He showed me that love was wrapped up in sacrifice in a way none of us ever thought possible. He was perfect. If you knew him, he could look at you and say, follow. And you, without a question, would leave your nets and walk. And he did that for us. So what shall we now do